Hey guys, tonight we begin with the flicker of a torch near a stall that sells fried cheese in the alley behind the Temple of Castor. The oil is old, the bread is stale, and no one's complaining. Somewhere nearby, a baker leans against a soot-smudged wall, chewing quietly, staring into nothing. It's barely dawn in ancient Rome, but already the city hungers. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing. Only if it feels right. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time? Is it where you are? Tonight isn't about emperors or empires. It isn't about conquest or oratory or gold-threaded robes. It's about what people held in their hands when no one was watching. When hunger whispered louder than honor, and dinner wasn't served, but scavenged. We'll wander down uneven streets where fig sellers shout beneath tattered awnings, where chickpeas are roasted in silence by boys with smoke in their eyes, where the richest smells come from the poorest corners, fish guts sizzling in olive oil, stale buns soaked in watered wine, a lone plum split open by a grateful hand. These aren't feasts. These are mouthfuls, moments, the kind that vanish almost as soon as they're swallowed, and yet leave behind something far heavier than fullness. Junk food, they might call it now. But to them, it was warmth. It was comfort. It was the thing that kept you moving toward noon, even if your feet ached and your toga smelled like sweat and smoke. They didn't have napkins. They barely had bread. But what they did have was appetite. Let's wander into their cravings. The sun had not yet broken over the tiled rooftops, but the city was already humming, not loudly, not with shouts or triumphs, but with quiet footsteps, with doors creaking open, with the slow turning of grinding stones behind thick plaster walls. The kind of morning that didn't announce itself. It arrived as a smell of warmed grain, of cracked garlic, of bread not yet burned in the poorer parts of Rome, where the alleys curled like thread dropped on the floor. Breakfast wasn't served. It was found. A crust here, a smear of oil there, and for the lucky, something warm, something spiced, something sweet. They called them libum, little honey cakes wrapped in fig leaves, sold not in shops, but from hands. Sticky fingers pressed them into palms, while the rest of the city still slept. There was no packaging, no parchment, just warmth, soft enough to tear with your teeth, sweet enough to quiet the stomach, heavy, enough to feel like a good omen for the day ahead. The buyers didn't linger. They bit and walked, always walking, to the bathhouses, to the grain lines, to the forum if they had reason, to nowhere in particular if they didn't dot in a corner near. At public latrines, a vendor sliced garlic buns with a broken knife. Not garlic as we know it, but crushed, soured cloves folded into yesterday's dough. She didn't speak. Her head was wrapped in a scarf that had long since stopped being white. But her hands moved like someone who had done this before, who would do it again and again until they didn't. A boy passed by with a wooden mug. Not wine. Not quite. It was watered down and steeped with fennel, just enough to warm the throat and disguise the bitterness. He sipped it like it was sacred, because in a way, it was. Morning in Rome wasn't about taste. It was about survival disguised as flavor. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Elsewhere, near a shrine to Mercury, an old man knelt to pray, not loudly, but with one palm raised toward the statue, the other holding a chunk of barley bread. He didn't look at it while he chewed. He didn't need to. It was the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow, crumbly, dense, dry unless dipped in oil or wine, or silenced. Rome woke like this, not with fanfare, not with marching, but with chewing. Quiet chewing, and footsteps on stone, for those with coin, not wealth, just a little. Extra, there was mortem, a kind of spread, garlic, cheese, and herbs, crushed together in a mortar until it smelled like someone meant to make a meal. They smeared it on bread, or on fingers, or sometimes just licked it off the side of a pestle. Rich? No, but flavorful, which was, to some, the next best thing. At the outer stalls, where traffic began to gather like flies, women sold hard-boiled. Eggs tinted gray from long boiling. The shells were cracked in places, the yolks dry, but they were protein. Energy. A bite before bargaining. A defense against fainting in the sun. They ate standing up. They always did. The benches were for the rich or the religious. The rest found walls, barrels, steps, or just squatted by the gutter and ate like they'd done it their whole lives. And they had. Some dipped their bread in garum, that sharp, salty fish sauce that clung to the air long after the bottle was gone. Others sprinkled cumin or coriander over mashed beans. Some even crumbled dried dates into their porridge, if they could afford a few. A woman carried her baby in one arm, a pot of lentil mash in the other. She didn't use a spoon. She just scooped and fed herself with flatbread torn in quiet haste. A baby was still asleep, nestled against her hip, unaware of the hunger he'd soon inherit. It's easy to think of Rome as marble and toga, as statues and speeches. But mornings like these tell another story. Of people who didn't dream of conquest, but of finding something warm before the day turned cruel. Who didn't ask for luxury, just for something edible. And maybe, if the gods were kind, something a little sweet in a courtyard, shared by 10 families. Someone reheated a barley porridge from the night before. It had gone thick, nearly. Solid, and needed coaxing with water and flame. A neighbor brought over a chipped bowl of dried mint to stir in. It wasn't about taste. It was about memory. Her mother had done it. So she did it too. The scent rose up through the roof slats and drifted to the street. People followed it like dogs. Not with shame, but with instinct. Even the patricians, those with slippers and slaves, had their versions of Roman junk food. Spiced pastries dusted with honey and crushed nuts, served on silver, yes, but devoured with the same greed, the same sleepy hunger. Pleasure doesn't know class, only appetite. A young man sat beneath a window ledge, peeling an overripe fig. He sucked the juice from his fingers and looked up at the empty sky, not for inspiration, just to feel like the day might begin differently than the last it wouldn't. But the thought was soft, and soft thoughts are rare currency in a place like Rome. And so the city ate, before it judged, before it arrested, before it chanted, debated, or conquered. It chewed, it swallowed. It licked honey from dirty knuckles and broke bread between. Cracked fingernails. It began, not with empire, but with crumbs. The marble columns stood tall, not as monuments to gods, but as quiet witnesses to smoke. They watched as steam curled around their bases in the early hours, where the grandeur of temples met the grime of survival. Between their feet, among fallen leaves and half-swept dust, the friars were already at work. Ancient Rome did not wait for noon to hunger. Here, in the shadow of stone that once echoed with prayer, oil popped and crackled in shallow pans that had seen better decades. Iron, blackened with time, handles bound in scraps of linen to avoid the sting of heat. Fires fed with whatever burned, olive pits, straw, or even scraps of parchment that once held promises. No one spoke loudly. Friars were not priests. They were craftsmen, yes, but without titles. Their rituals were simpler. Heat the oil, test it with a drop of dough, watch it sizzle, and feed the city one handful at a time. There was a man with fingers scarred from 1,000 mornings. He worked without looking, without rushing, without pride. His face was damp with sweat, not from the sun, but from the fire that licked at his knees. He dropped battered root vegetables into the oil, turnips, parsnips, sometimes slices of old carrot, and watched as they danced and browned. His reward? The smell. It rose like incense. Not to heaven, but to the noses of those who hadn't eaten since yesterday. If they were lucky, they had a few coins. If not, they stood and stared, hoping to be offered the last burnt piece, the scrap too dark. For sale. The columns didn't care. They had seen centuries of this. Not far from him, a woman fried dough. Not sweet, not rich, but soft and golden. She shaped it with 2 fingers, dropped it with grace, and let it puff like a pillow kissed by fire. She didn't smile. Smiling wasted energy. But her eyes watched each customer closely, remembering who paid yesterday and who didn't. Sometimes she brushed the top with garlic oil, sometimes with a smear of fish paste, sometimes nothing. Just heat and hope. A child, no more than 6, squatted nearby, tracing shapes in the ash. He wasn't there to play. He was waiting for leftovers. He didn't ask. He had learned not to. And when a piece fell from a plate, too hot to eat, too crooked to sell, he snatched it and ran like a mouse into the shadows. This was Roan's quiet commerce. No scales, no registers, no names, just exchange, hot food for cold coin, warmth for waiting, a bite for a blessing. Some of the friars whispered prayers over their pans, not to Jupiter or Venus, but to their fathers, their mothers, the ones who had once done the same thing in the same spot before their bones had joined the city's dust. A few customers came in silence, wrapped in cloaks that smelled of mildew and long walks. Laborers, couriers, prostitutes, all hungry, all tired, all anonymous. They cupped their hands like bowls. They counted their coins twice, and when the food touched their lips, they didn't talk. They closed their eyes. In a corner stall, barely wide enough to turn in, an old couple fried cheese. Not fresh cheese. Rome's poor rarely had that. It was curdled and pressed, salted and sour. But when fried, when browned and bubbling, it could pass for indulgence. For luxury, they served it with flatbread, ripped from a shared stack. The bread was tough, the edges singed, but it folded around the hot cheese like parchment folds around a secret. Their hands trembled, but their rhythm never broke. Cheese, flip, bread, wrap, coin, again, and again, and again. Some stalls sold small fish, battered and fried whole. Bones, tails, eyes, all included. You ate them as they were, hot and fast, before you noticed what you were chewing. They crunched like burnt paper. They tasted like salt and smoke. People lined up for those fish, not because they were good, but because they were enough, because they were hot, because they filled the air with a smell that said, someone is cooking. Someone is still here. Above all this, the Forum loomed like a god on a hill, full of marble and debate and clean sandals. But down here, beneath the columns, the city truly lived. Greasy fingers wiped on aprons. Hot oil splattered onto sandals. Hunger was not poetic. It was practical. It needed salt. It needed grease. The stones underfoot were darkened with years of spills. If you stepped wrong, you slid. If you stood still too long, your feet grew sticky. But no one complained. This was Rome's breakfast floor. And yet there was a kind of reverence here, a sacred rhythm. A man handed over his last coin for 3. Fried olives stuffed with herbs. He didn't look sad. He looked grateful. He chewed slowly, swallowed hard, and then leaned his back against the base of a column, as if that ancient stone might absorb a little of his weariness. A woman carried a small cloth pouch of fried beans home to her sister. She didn't eat. One herself. Not yet. She just walked, carefully, like she was carrying a treasure. Even dogs knew the smell. They hovered near the edges, pails low, eyes sharp, waiting, hoping Dot, and sometimes someone would toss a scrap toward them without a word. The dog would catch it midair, gulp it down, and vanish. Dot, by late morning, the fryers would vanish too. Fires doused with water, pans stacked in corners, ash swept back into baskets. The space left behind would smell like ghosts, oil, sweat, garlic, fire, and Rome would move on. But for a little while, beneath those towering columns, the forgotten citizens of an unforgettable empire found something warm, something fried, something theirs, not eternal glory, just enough. The smell came first, long before you saw the jar or the vendor or the tiny brown ladle. You smelled it, sharp, sour, briny. A smell that crept around corners, clung to togas, and lived in the yaciano. Back of the throat long after the meal was over. Garum, not a dish, not even a food really, but a sauce, a relic, a ritual, a flavor so old and stubborn it outlived its makers, staining amphory and memory. A light dot, it was fish, crushed, fermented, and forgotten in jars left to ripen beneath the sun. Anchovies, mackerel, sardines, whole, gutted, layered with salt, and sealed with time. Some jars sat for weeks, others for seasons. What came out wasn't pretty. It wasn't fragrant. But it was precious. Dot, because in a world without refrigeration, without spice ships or supermarkets, flavor was fleeting. And salt was currency. Garum gave salt life. Dot, in the outer lanes of the Roman market, where food stalls pressed tight against crumbling brick, garum was sold in whispers. Vendors didn't shout its name. They gestured, a twitch of the wrist, a nod of the head, and suddenly someone was spooning brown liquid into your clay bowl like it was medicine. Dot, it looked like something that had gone bad. It smelled like something that had never been good. But poured over stale bread, it resurrected it, mixed with oil and herbs. It made beans taste like dinner. Added to porridge or pulses or fish stew, it made everything louder, sharper, alive. Girl in sandals with cracked soles dipped her bread into a smear of garum pooled in her palm. She flinched at the first taste, then smiled. It wasn't sweetness she wanted. It was strength. And garum had that, in salt, in sting, in soul. Behind her, a man with a crooked back stood over a small table. He had 3 jars, one cheap, one middling, one prized. He didn't explain the difference. He didn't need to. The poor pointed. The rich sniffed. Everyone paid. Some garum was thin as broth, others thick like syrup. Some carried notes of thyme or oregano, others the unmistakable funk of too much sun. A few brave sellers infused it with vinegar or pounded pine nuts into the mix. Experimentation was dangerous, but sometimes reward came. At public kitchens, where stew pots simmered all day, garum was a constant companion. Cooks didn't measure. They poured by feel, a bit for luck, a bit for memory, a bit for the ghosts, because garum wasn't just taste. It was ancestry. It smelled like the coast, like fishing nets, like old men yelling on boats before dawn. It reminded you that Rome was not all marble and market stalls. It was also sea, salt, decay, and life that grew from it. A young couple shared a bowl of lentils in a dark corner of the forum. She poured garum from a hollowed-out fig shell. He tore the bread. They didn't speak. There was no need. This wasn't a romantic meal. It was fuel. They chewed in rhythm with each other. Not fast, not slow, just enough. In homes, garum sat on shelves like a prayer scroll, not too close to the fire, not too far from reach. It was for flavoring meals, curing hangovers, even healing wounds. A few drops behind the ear for balance. A warm spoonful for a queasy stomach. It was both seasoning and superstition, but not everyone adored it. Some hated the smell. They pinched their noses and muttered curses. They called it fish rot, called it barbaric, called it the taste of poverty. And yet, even they kept a jar, because garum, like fire, was hard to love, but harder to live without. In the kitchens of inns and taverns, the garum was cheap, watered down, harsh, but still poured, still used. Patrons asked for the good stuff, and were lied to kindly. They drank their mulled wine, and never knew. At sea, garum traveled in sealed clay bottles wrapped in straw. Soldiers carried it across deserts. Merchants traded it in cities that could barely pronounce it. Even emperors, it said, had favorite blends. But this story isn't about emperors. It's about a boy who stirred garum into barley paste, because there was nothing else. It's about an old woman who kissed the lid of her jar every morning, like it was a relic of a lost husband. It's about neighbors who argued over who had the better recipe and shared it anyway. Garum was romang, but more than that, it was human. A reminder that even spoiled things, if handled with care, could feed. A reminder that flavor mattered, even when food was scarce. A reminder that the past was always fermenting beneath the surface, waiting to rise, pungent and uninvited. But necessary. At sunset, the garum jars were sealed again, wrapped, stored, hidden from flies, heat thieves. But the smell lingered. In the folds of tunics. In the cracks of wooden spoons. In the breath of those who had eaten too quickly. And in the air between the columns, where salt met stone and Rome reminded itself, through every tangy bite, that even in decay there was something to be saved. They were everywhere, and yet invisible. The hands that swept the floors, poured the wine, stirred the pots. The backs that bent over fire pits, that carried baskets heavier than breath. The ones who ate last, or not at all. In Rome, slavery was the silence between footsteps, the breath held during speeches, the presence that dared not speak, but always served. And when they ate, when the world looked away long enough for hunger to be noticed, they did not dine. They snatched, they scavenged, they remembered what was left and how to make it taste like something that hadn't been forgotten. Their food was not plated. It was not perfumed. It was scraps, soaked in wine so sour it made the jaw tremble. It was crusts scraped clean of mold. It was onions blackened by ash, and then peeled until the burn was a memory. It was olives so old they no longer had a name. Just a pit. They sat in corners, on steps, on dirt, anywhere but the tables. And yet, even in that, there was ritual. Bread was soaked in broth made from boiled bones, sometimes even fish bones, too brittle to sell, but still strong enough to flavor water. The bread softened, swelled, surrendered. It was eaten slowly, not to savor, but to prolong. Sometimes they were allowed the bottoms of pots, that thick, scorched layer of lentils or barley that clung to the edge. It was hard, chewy, almost bitter, but it was real food, and it was warm. The youngest among them learned early how to steal without being seen. Not theft, just survival. A date fallen beneath a table, a fig half crushed in a merchant's basket, a bean dropped by a distracted cook. These were treasures, each one a silent joy. And yet they laughed, not often, not loudly, but in the quiet moments when no one was watching. Over a shared lump of roasted garlic, they joked about whose breath would chase the rats away. Over a too salty handful of olives, they giggled like children who had tricked the gods, and they had tricks. So many. Boiled cabbage was turned into stew with nothing but water and thyme. Wheat husks, normally fed to animals, were toasted. and ground, made into a rough porridge with wild herbs picked from cracks in stone walls. A meal made of nothing, but made all the same. A boy, no older than 9, sat on a stone beside the laundry vats. His hands were red from lye, but he smiled as he chewed on a sliver of dried apple he had hidden in his tunic. He didn't eat it all at once. He broke it into 4 pieces, one for each corner of the day. A woman kneeling by the fire grinned as she flicked a drop of broth from the ladle to her tongue. It was scalding. She didn't flinch. It was better than cold. Even under cruelty, even under chains, food held power. Not power over others, but power to remember, to feel, to stay alive one more day, to tell the body, yes, you are still here. They used garlic like a shield. Its scent clung to the skin. It masked other smells, sweat, smoke, despair. Garlic made everything taste sharper, even memory got once. A man boiled roots he'd found near the aqueduct. They were bitter, fibrous, unpleasant, but he had oil. Not much, barely a breath. But he poured it slowly, carefully, into the pot, stirred, tasted, closed his eyes. For a moment, it was good. Sometimes they weren't allowed to cook. Sometimes they weren't allowed to sit. So they carried dried beans in their sleeves. Dried figs tied in strips of cloth. They chewed them while walking, while scrubbing, while surviving. And the moments when kindness came, when someone left a heel of bread on purpose, or a kitchen girl turned her back so a peach could disappear, those moments were miracles. Not because of the food, but because of what it meant. Someone had seen them dot in the heat of a Roman summer. Slaves would suck on olive pits, not for taste, but to keep the mouth from drying. In the winter, they wrapped their hands around cooking pots, not just for warmth, but to inhale whatever was bubbling within. A slave working in the latrines had a secret stash, not of gold, but of dried lentils. He kept them in a pouch beneath. The floorboards. No one touched them. They were sacred. The difference between starvation and sleep. And there was ashdot, so much ash. Some used it to bake flat rounds of dough, pressed thin and cooked on hot stones. Ash gave them a bitter crust, but also made them last longer, made them crisp. They crunched between the teeth like stubborn hope dot in Rome. Food was hierarchy. It told you who you were. But here, in the shadows, food was resistance. Each bite was an act of staying, of not fading. They were not remembered in marble, not written about in poetry, but in the dust of old kitchens, in the charred bottoms of old pots. Their meals remained dot simple, dot scattered, dot sacred dot, and in that, they are eternal. Sweetness was not a right dot in ancient Rome. It was a rumor, a blessing, a gift that came rarely and never stayed long. The poor didn't expect it. The working hands didn't ask. But still, sometimes the gods were kind, and a little sweetness fell through the cracks. Not sugar. That was foreign, costly, unknown to most. But honey, thick, golden, stubborn, found its way into the lives of even those who lived in soot and silence. And it always came with ashdot, because in the places where people couldn't afford delicacy, flavor was cooked in smoke. Bread baked on stone floors, dough fried in reused oil, roots roasted in blackened pits. Every bite bore a mark of fire dot, so when honey touched it, something else happened, something small, but miraculous dot. A woman spread honey over a barley cake. The cake was gray and rough, like stone. It had no butter, no leavening, no scent. But the honey, stolen from a cracked pot or traded for a favor, glistened like sunlight. Caught in a puddle dot, she broke the cake into 4 pieces. 1 for herself, 3 for the children still asleep under a shared blanket. They'd wake to sweetness. Not much, but enough to think the day might be good. That was what honey did. It made food feel like a gift, even when it wasn't. There were honeyed nuts, sometimes pine nuts if they were lucky, walnuts if the market hadn't taken them all, coated in warmth, then cooled on scraps of stone until they hardened into little golden clusters. They were wrapped in cloth, carried carefully, given as apologies or birthdays, even if no one quite remembered what day it was. In the alleys near the bakeries, children would press their noses to the ovens, watching loaves brushed with honey bake until the crust bubbled. Not for them, for someone with sandals that didn't crack at the heel. But the smell? That belonged to everyone. Vendors sold fried dough dusted with honey and cumin. It was sticky. It clung to fingers. People ate it standing up, in doorways, over drains. They licked the honey from their nails. They let it drip. They didn't wipe it away. Sweetness was not to be wasted. A man once traded half a tunic for a pot of honey, old, crystallized, nearly forgotten. He carried it like an heirloom, wrapped in linen, hidden beneath a floorboard, not for today, not even for hunger, but for the day his wife gave birth. That day, he said, should taste golden, and some used honey for healing, mixed with herbs, smeared on burns, spooned into sick mouths. It wasn't medicine, not really, but it felt close. The way it soothed, the way it lingered. A grandmother stirred it into warm milk made from goat scrapings. Her granddaughter coughed through the night. She pressed the bowl to the girl's lips and whispered, "This is what the rich drink every night." It wasn't true, but it worked. And yet, honey came at a cost. Bees were not kept by the poor. Honey had to be bought, begged, or taken from the wild, sometimes from combs found in tree hollows, sometimes from broken amphorae spilled during transit, sometimes from dreams, because the truth was, most didn't taste honey more than a few times in a year, maybe during Saturnalia, maybe when someone died and the family cooked something sweet in their name, maybe when a lover whispered, "I found something," and opened their hand to reveal a gold-slicked fig. One boy brought home a honey date he'd been given by a kind merchant. He didn't eat it. He held it in his hand until it grew warm, until it softened and nearly slipped from his fingers. Then he gave it to his sister. He said, "Taste this. It's what Rome tastes like if you're lucky." She bit it slowly, eyes wide, as if she had bitten the moon. In the corners of taverns, the smell of ash always lingered. Tables rubbed with oil to hide stains, bread dark from soot, wine watered thin. But on good nights, someone would bring out a plate, small, chipped, but holding something warm and dripping. Honey cakes, made with flour that was barely sifted, and oil that had been reused more than once. But still, they were cakes, sweet, warm, real. People closed their eyes. They chewed slowly. Even the drunkest among them sat up straighter. For a moment, the ash didn't matter. It never truly vanished, of course. Ash lived in the cracks of everything. It whispered through every bite. But when honey was poured on top, it didn't disappear. It simply softened, became part of the taste, not just the texture. That was the magic, the marriage of bitter and sweet, of smoke and sugar, of what life gave and what people made. Of it. Rome was not kind, but its people were clever. They knew how to make fire burn just enough, knew how long to boil the dates, knew when to stir and when to let things settle. A woman with only 3 teeth left chewed a honeyed fig as if it were gold. And in that moment, it was. Because honey on ash is not just a food. It's a promise. That sweetness can still exist in the burned places. They rolled like little stones across the wooden cart. Dry, golden, quiet. CHICKPEA. In the roar of the Roman crowd, in the clang of sandals and the murmur of debate. They made no sound of their own. But they were there. Always. There, in bowls, in pouches, in fingers dipped in salt and oil, they were not grand. They were not rare. But they were everywhere, and they whispered their way into the mouths of soldiers, vendors, children, slaves, anyone who needed to eat without needing a plate, in the market square. A boy with soot on his face roasted them in a cracked clay pot. No firewood, only coals. No seasoning, only salt. He shook the pot in small circles, like he was coaxing the chickpeas to dance, to crisp, to become more than just seeds. The smell was smoky, warm, oddly comforting. It drifted up past the awnings and into the streets, where people followed. It without realizing they had turned. They weren't expensive. A small handful for a coin. A larger pouch if you brought your own cloth. Some vendors sold them by weight, but most by trust, scooped by hand, dropped into palm, exchanged for whatever clinked. People chewed them while walking, while watching, while waiting. Outside the amphitheater, as the crowd settled in and the sea, sand was raked smooth. Chickpeas passed from hand to hand like prayers. Roasted, spiced, a little burned. No one complained. The crunch was satisfying. A small thunder in the teeth. One that made you feel full, even if your stomach knew better. If you were clever, you sucked on them to make them last longer. If you were desperate, you chewed the skins and spat the rest into a rag. But if you were lucky, or just had a few moments of peace, you held them warm in your hand and let the scent remind you of home. Chickpeas didn't care who you were. They were eaten by senators in private, by slaves in shadows, by children with dirt under their nails. They traveled. Better than bread. They lasted longer than figs. They didn't spoil. They simply waited. One woman roasted hers in a pan with thyme. She didn't sell them. She gave them to her husband before he left for the docks. "Eat these slowly," she said. "They'll hold you until the sun sets." They did in a cramped apartment above a wine shop. A mother ground chickpeas into a coarse paste with garlic and vinegar. She spread it on rough bread for her children, not because they loved the taste, but because it filled the gaps. The kind of fullness that let you fall asleep without your ribs reminding you they were still there. There was no ceremony to it. Just survival shaped into food. In the public baths, men shared handfuls of chickpeas as they sat on worn stones, drying slowly, talking even more slowly. The sound of crunching mixed with steam. Time moved differently in those moments. One chickpea, then another, and another. A small rhythm. A comfort. Vendors carried them in baskets lined with cloth. They walked the streets calling softly, not shouting, just offering. Warm, salted, fresh. Their voices blended with the sound of footsteps, of distant goats, of a city that never truly rested. And in temples, chickpeas were sometimes left as offerings. Not lavish, not gold, but honest. A bowl of them placed beside. A statue, humble, warm. A prayer in the language of the hungry. Some flavored them with cumin. Some with dried citrus peel. A few brave cooks tossed them with honey and served them cold. Most just ate them plain. The flavor was in the roast, in the fire, in the fact that they were there. A soldier returning from the frontier once said that chickpeas reminded him of home more than wine. "They're what you taste when nothing else is left," he whispered. Then he popped one into his mouth and chewed like it mattered. At night, families gathered in quiet. Not always around tables, often just together, near a brazier, on worn mats or bare stone. A shared bowl. One hand after another. Laughter in between. Not because the food was funny, but because they were still together. That's what chickpeas were best at, reminding you of the moment, of presence, of hands reaching, of a bowl not yet empty. A child once dropped his entire handful into the dust. He stared at them for a long time, kneeling, unmoving. Then an old man walking by stopped, bent down, and gave him his own. No words, just the gift. Warm and salted Dot. The boy didn't thank him. He just held them tightly, like someone had handed him a sunrise Dot. And so the chickpeas whispered on Dot in stalls, in satchels, in stories told beside fire. They asked nothing, promised little, but delivered enough to fill a pocket. Enough to distract a hungry thought. Enough to survive until dinner, if dinner ever came. Rome was built on marble, but it endured on food like this. Quiet food. Warm food. Food that knew your name, even if no one else did. And long after the palaces crumbled, the aqueducts dried, and the forums fell silent. Somewhere, someone still roasts chickpeas over coals. And the whisper continues, Dot, it was always a little sour. Not the kind of sour that made you spit, but the kind that made your lips tighten. Just for a second, before. Your body remembered this was food. And food, no matter how it smelled, was not to be wasted. Cheese in Rome didn't come in wheels or wedges, unless you were wealthy. For most, it came in lumps. Pale, soft, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes just scraped into a leaf and handed over Dot. It came from sheep, from goats, from milk that had traveled too far, sat too long, curdled too fast. It wasn't made to impress. It was made not to rot. And yet, even in its plainness, it filled a role. The in-between. Not a meal, not a feast. Just something to hold the hunger at bay until the sun moved a little higher in the sky. Street cheese, they called it. Not in words, but in how they treated it. Quick, quiet, eaten with the shoulders hunched and the eyes lowered. It was food for walking, not dining Dot in the stalls near the Subura. A woman sold cheese from a shallow tray lined with straw. The tray always smelled faintly of ash. She cut slivers with a small iron blade, her fingers stained from smoke and brine. People didn't speak to her much. They just pointed, paid, and chewed. There was no glamour in cheese, but there was comfort. You could crumble it onto bread, if you had any. You could mix it with herbs, if the gods were generous. Or you could simply hold it between your fingers and eat it like a secret. And that's how most did. Not proudly, but not quite ashamed either. Just quickly. Like they didn't want to be caught eating it, because cheese was a food of in-betweeners. Of those who weren't starving, but weren't full. Of those who weren't rich enough for roast goose, but not poor enough to gnaw barley raw Dot. It was something you bought with your last coin, knowing it wouldn't last the day. A young boy once traded his shoes for cheese. The soles were worn through. The laces were just twine. But still, he handed them over and took the cheese in both hands, held it close like it might vanish. He didn't eat it right away. He waited until he was alone, in the alley behind the dye house, where no one could see his bare feet. There, he bit into it, slowly, reverently, like it was something sacred Dot, and maybe, for him, it was Dot in a quiet bathhouse kitchen. Workers salted fresh curds until their palms ached. They packed them into baskets, pressed them flat, left them to dry on cool tiles. No music, no chatter, just the hush of labor and the sharp, clean scent of lactic life. Sometimes they flavored the cheese with garlic, or honey, or fig skins, but not often. That kind of generosity came with seasons, and with bosses in good moods. The rest of the time was plain Dot, and that was fine, because Plain was still there. Plain still fed. Outside the brothels, cheese was sold in the dark, hidden in pouches, traded like secrets. The clients didn't want to be seen buying food from the same place they bought pleasure. But hunger doesn't ask permission. A man in a cloak took his wedge with shaking hands. He looked around, then disappeared into a side street, chewing. With a kind of guilt that didn't come from the food Dot, there was always something quiet about cheese. Something that made people lower their voices. Maybe it was the smell, maybe the texture, or maybe the simple fact that it reminded you how close you were to needing more. Cheese doesn't fill you. It suggests fullness. It buys you an hour. 2, if you're patient. In the forum, someone once dropped their piece, just a small corner. Nothing more. No one reached for it. But a dog, thin as twine, patted over and licked it clean. Then sat, waiting, just in case another miracle fell from someone's hand. In apartments above bakeries, cheese was melted onto old bread, turned soft again by heat and hope. Children tore the corners off, while mothers told stories about gods who turned cows to stone or rained milk from the sky. They knew the stories weren't true, but stories, like cheese, could stretch the truth when it was hungry. Not all cheese was equal. Some was hard, aged, dry, scraped from the rind of a wheel someone else had already carved. Some was soft, so fresh it still wept when cut, the whey running into the palm like tears. But all of it was shared. Broken with knives or fingers or teeth, handed across thresholds, passed down stairwells, wrapped in cloth that had once been a shirt. Rome's great halls dined on delicacies, but its streets survived on cheese. Sour, stubborn, silent cheese. There was a man who saved cheese rinds in a clay jar, not to eat, but to remember. Each one marked a day he had enough. He never told anyone. Just touched the jar sometimes when sleep wouldn't come. In the back of a tavern, a woman gave a piece of cheese to a stranger, just because his eyes looked tired. He took it, nodded, sat in the corner and chewed with both hands in his lap. The thing about cheese. It asks nothing. It promises nothing. It just is. And sometimes, being there is enough. Rome was always crumbling. Not the marble, not yet, but everything beneath it. The bread, the walls, the markets, even the sandals that walked its streets, left behind pieces of themselves with every step. The streets weren't clean. They weren't meant to be. Rome breathed dust. It wore a coat of ash and old flour, smeared with grease and soot and the soft, unbothered footprints of 1,000 hungry souls. And in every crease of every footpath, there were crumbs. Not just food, history, ground down from loaves too dry to chew, from cakes broken in haste, from biscuits shared with shaking hands. Crumbs in the sandals, in the folds of tunics, under the fingernails of children who didn't know what it meant to be full, only what it meant to still be eating. Vendors swept their stalls at the end of the day, not to clean, but to collect. Not everything that fell was lost. Some of it could be salvaged. The largest pieces went back into baskets, the smallest into the mouths of those who waited nearby with eyes low and hands ready. There were no brooms in most of these stalls, just hands and hope. A girl stood barefoot at the edge of a bread seller's tent. She didn't ask for anything. She just waited. When the crusts were thrown, she darted forward. One piece caught in her sleeve. She didn't smile. She simply bit into it and walked on. Crumbs fell like snow from the lips of the city. Down from balconies, through market slats, off the laps of tired men eating while sitting on crates. Bread, when torn in haste, always left something behind. And Rome was always in a hurry. Sometimes the crumbs mixed with dirt and became indistinguishable. Sometimes they stayed dry enough to be swept into a palm, kissed once for luck, and swallowed whole. A man selling second-hand sandals once said he judged a person's week by the crumbs in their shoes. Flour meant fresh bread. Burnt flecks meant the bottom crust. Nothing at all. That meant fasting, chosen or not. Even in temples where incense swirled and prayers whispered, crumbs gathered, left behind by guards or priests or the hopeful. Poor who brought their own food and sat quietly at the edge, nibbling. A boy once followed a trail of crumbs down an alleyway, not out of curiosity, out of instinct. It led to a basket someone had dropped. Inside was nothing but a half-eaten roll, cold and stiff. He ate it anyway. And for a moment, the alley felt warm. Crumbs weren't just waste. They were memory. The corner of a loaf shared between brothers. The last bite a mother saved for her daughter. The hardened crust dipped in oil so it wouldn't hurt to chew. Crumbs told stories when the words were gone, and sandals told another. They flapped. They dragged. They slapped against cobblestone in time with the heartbeat of the street. Most were handmade, patched again and again, saws thin to nothing. But they carried Rome, and Rome carried crumbs. A baker once said, "No one ever eats the first. Loaf perfectly. The first slice falls apart. The heel crumbles. The middle caves in. But people eat it anyway, because hunger isn't patient. It doesn't wait for perfection. Near the aqueduct, where the water dripped slower in summer, women rinsed cloths over stones. They shook them out into the breeze. Crumbs flew like ash. Birds followed. So did children. The birds always won. But once, a child caught a piece in midair, a crust no bigger than his thumb. He popped it into his mouth and grinned like he'd stolen treasure from Jupiter himself. Even in the homes of the modestly comfortable, crumbs ruled the day. They gathered on wooden tables, in baskets, on the corners of benches. At night, they were collected, pressed into mash with milk or wine, and eaten again. Nothing wasted, not a bite, not a speck. The clever even used them to thicken stew, to coat dried fish before frying, to stretch a meal into something that felt like more. That's what crumbs did. They gave you the illusion of abundance. A handful of nothing turned into something if you added warmth, patience, and a bit of salt. In the forum, a man offered stale bread broken into tiny pieces, served in a bowl with olive oil and rosemary. A soldier's breakfast, he called. It cost less than a whisper. People bought it anyway, because it filled the space where hunger lived, not with richness, but with rhythm. Bite, chew, swallow, hope. A woman rushed crumbs from her lap onto the street. They danced for a moment, caught in the light, before disappearing into the cracks. She didn't notice, but a boy nearby did. He crept forward and picked up the largest one. He didn't eat it right away. He waited until she was gone. Crumbs were never stolen. They were taken back, because everything in Rome had already belonged to someone else before. The sandals walked on. They wore thin, they cracked, but they left a trail. Not of blood or greatness, but of crumbs. Tiny remnants of survival. Soft evidence that someone had eaten. Once, and maybe would again. The dust never truly settled in Rome. It clung to sandals, swirled in courtyards, drifted down from rooftops, and clung to the air like a second skin. It was inescapable, familiar, trusted, but every now and then, in that soft haze of earth and ash, something sweet would fall into the world like a mistake. A date, not the kind marked on calendars or carved into stone, but the kind that fit. In the palm of your hand, wrinkled, brown, heavy with sugar and shadow. Fruit from another place, carried across seas, across sand, across heat and time. And yet somehow, here it was, nestled in a cloth pouch, hidden in the folds of a vendor's robe, or dropped quietly into the hands of someone who needed sweetness more than speech. A woman wiped her hands on her apron before breaking a date. In two, the fruit pulled apart slowly, the strands inside like softened threads of sun. She gave one half to the child on her hip and popped the other into her mouth. It stuck to her teeth. She didn't mind. Dates were sticky things. They stuck to fingers, to memory, to stories whispered between sips of watered wine. They were too rich to waste and too rare to expect. Even the pits were saved. Some chewed them, gently, like they might give up more flavor. Some tucked them in bags as tiny totems of better moments. Others crushed them into powder to mix with barley or paste, turning waste into something vaguely nourishing. Dates came from elsewhere, from palms that had never seen Roman stone, from winds that carried no Latin. But once they arrived, they were loved, not like bread, which was daily, or fish, which was practical. Dates were different. They were gifts, and not always purchased, sometimes earned, sometimes stolen, sometimes handed over by someone who had two and chose kindness instead of fullness. A boy working at the docks once found a crate cracked open by accident. Inside, cloth bundles filled with soft fruit. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He reached in and took just one, a single date. He ate it behind a barrel, in silence, like it might disappear if chewed too loudly. In the homes of the wealthy, dates were sometimes stuffed with pine nuts, cheese, or pepper, served on trays, glazed with honey, eaten with pinkies lifted, and words curled like smoke. But in the streets, they were eaten whole, as they came, dust and all. A baker once pressed dates into leftover dough, shaping small rolls that were neither bread nor cake. He sold them to laborers who bit into them with surprise, then smiled. Even the ones who didn't like sweets appreciated the gesture. Because sweetness wasn't always about taste. It was about gesture. A wife placing one beside her husband's bread before he woke. A neighbor sharing two with a woman whose fire had gone cold. A child saving half until his friend came back from the tanner's stall. That's how dates survived in the city. Not just as food, but as signs of love, of attention, of mercy. They were packed in soldiers' bags for long journeys. They didn't rot easily. They didn't melt. They reminded the marching of places with trees and peace. Some believed dates had power, that they strengthened the heart, that they warmed the spirit, that they softened grief, if only briefly. So they were brought to funerals, chewed between, prayers handed to the mourning like quiet instructions. Live even now. At dusk, the date vendors packed up slowly, gathering their cloths, their coins, their bruised fruit. The dates left behind weren't thrown away. They were eaten. By the sellers themselves, by their children, by whoever wandered by last. One girl found a date on the ground near the market steps, covered in dust but whole. She held it in her hand a long time. Then, with her thumb, wiped it clean against her sleeve, bit into it, let the sweetness anchor her. For a moment, she didn't feel the blisters on her feet, the hunger in her belly. She just chewed and breathed and felt something like gold dissolve on her tongue. That's what dates did. They reminded the body it could still feel joy. They were the punctuation at the end of an otherwise bitter sentence. A soft pause, a small sigh, a slow blink between storms. A man with a scar across his neck once said, "There are days when a single date is enough to make you believe you'll see tomorrow." No one laughed. No one doubted. They just nodded, then reached into their own bags to see if they had one left. Dates in the dust, brown against brown, lost and then found, eaten slowly, or all at once, with eyes closed, with thanks whispered only in breath. Because even in Rome, even in the noise and the grime and the cold edges of morning, there were still moments of grace. And sometimes they tasted like fruit. Dusk didn't fall on Rome, it settled, like flour on a baker's hands, soft, slow, in layers dot, and as the sun dipped below the rooftops and left, the city glowing with gold and smoke, the ovens still burned. The bakeries of Rome were not quiet places, not even at night. Especially not at night, because for many, dusk was the beginning of hunger, not the end. The time when the day's wages were counted exchanged, and finally, spent often on bread that had just emerged from the heat. The smoke told the story first. It curled up from behind stone walls, mixing with the scent of char and barley, salt and ash. It didn't rise straight. It danced, like it knew it was being followed. Children chased it through alleyways, noses lifted, eyes wide, guessing which bakery had burned the crust just enough to make the edges crackle. Inside, the air was thick, not suffocating, just full. Full of breath, of sweat, of work. Full of the sound of paddles tapping stone, of flour being swept, of dough being slapped into shape. Each movement had its rhythm, not rushed, not careless, just practiced. Ancient. The ovens were deep and wide, mouths blackened by years of flame, and always, always glowing. A man pulled out a tray with bare hands wrapped in wet rags. He winced, but didn't stop. The bread inside was dark at the edges, pale at the center, still singing quietly from the heat trapped within. He placed it on the wooden rack behind him, without looking. Already reaching for the next dot, his daughter stood beside him, brushing flour from the tops, with a bundle of twigs tied into a makeshift broom. She didn't speak. She knew when to brush, when to turn, when to hide the loaf that had burned too much. It would be eaten later, at home, with oil, with silence. Outside, a line had begun to form. Not formal, not neat. Just bodies gathering like moths near the warmth. They didn't talk much. Just coughed, shifted, stretched sore backs. The smell was enough to quiet even the loudest. One woman pressed her coin so tightly into her palm, it left a circle. She was buying only one loaf, just enough to share. Just enough to make the soup at home taste like something new. Another man came not for bread, but for warmth. He stood near the side vent where the smoke escaped, letting it coat his skin. Like a blanket, he didn't ask for anything, just breathed. Slowly, as if the heat might fill something that food could not. The loaves were round, flat, sometimes oval, scored with lines that meant something once, ownership or origin, but now just looked like tired smiles. They were stacked in baskets, wrapped in cloth, sometimes sprinkled with seeds. If the day had been generous, some people carried their bread home on cloth slings tied over one shoulder. Some simply held it in their arms like a sleeping child. One man tied his to his belt with a strip of leather, as if it were part of him, necessary, close. They didn't always wait to get home. A girl tore a corner off her family's loaf the moment it was handed over. She looked up. No one stopped her. So she chewed slowly, the steam rising from her lips, the crust leaving scratches on her tongue. She didn't mind. That first bite, when dusk met warmth, when hunger met salt, that was the moment. That was the reason they waited. Sometimes loaves were baked with fillings, herbs, onions, dried fruit. Those cost more, but smelled stronger, richer. They tempted even those who knew better. A man once spent the last of his savings on a fruit-stuffed roll. He told no one. Just ate it alone, behind a pillar, laughing softly to himself between bites. The bakery was more than a place to buy food. It was a place to be seen, to exist, to feel like part of something ancient and necessary. A boy offered to sweep ash in exchange for leftover dough. He was given a ball no larger than his fist. He carried it away like treasure, later roasting it in a fire built from stolen wood. The outside blackened, the inside raw. He ate it anyway. It was his. Sometimes neighbors pooled their coins to buy the biggest loaf. They broke it together, each taking a part, saving the rest. They didn't talk about the sharing. They just did it. Because no one wanted to be the one with empty hands when the smell of dusk filled the street. And then came the end, the last batch, the final sweep of the oven. The slow, quiet closing of shutters the bakers didn't celebrate. They just leaned back, wiped their arms, and sat down for the first time since dawn. The bread that didn't sell was counted, stored, set aside for the next day, or quietly handed off to those who waited just long enough to be noticed. Outside, the smoke faded. The heat dimmed. The baskets emptied, but the air still remembered. The scent of crust, of yeast, of hands that had worked through sweat and flame to turn hunger into comfort. And long after the bakery doors were shut, Rome still smelled like bread. The scent came before the sight, sharp, salty, a little sour. It clung to the sleeves of vendors and the hems of tunics, woven into the linen of aprons and the wooden grain of every table that had ever served a meal to someone too poor to forget their hunger. Fish, not fresh, not grand, but salted, dried, smoked, and saved. A kind that didn't swim in Roman fountains, but in brine and barrels, packed tight and silent. Anchovies, sardines, mackerel, whatever the sea could give and time could preserve. You didn't eat around the bones. You ate with them. They snapped like brittle twigs, tiny but loud, not unpleasant. Just honest people wrapped them in cloth, stored them in waxed leaves, kept them in corners of satchels as if they were letters from the ocean, pungent, precious, barely edible, and yet always eaten. A man once kept a salted sardine in his pocket for 3 days before biting into it. He would take it out, hold it close to his face, inhale like it was a prayer, then tuck it back away, saving it, delaying it, making sure the moment of eating was something earned. That's what these fish were, not just food, but intervals. Tiny thresholds between morning and night, labor and collapse, despair and distraction. A boy selling firewood outside a bathhouse once traded his last bundle for 2 small fish tied with string. He didn't cook them. He chewed them as he walked, slowly, letting the salt sting the sides of his tongue. He didn't even blink. They were hard, these little fish. Hard to chew, hard to love, but full of something more important than taste. Endurance. Mothers mashed them into barley mash to make it taste like more. Vendors mashed them into paste with garlic and vinegar and spread them on flatbread like butter. They lasted longer than most marriages. In crowded kitchens, fish bones piled into bowls like splinters of memory. Every cook had their own way of dealing with them. Some ground them into sauces. Some boiled them for broth. Some tossed them into the streets and let the dogs argue over them in the night. No one wasted them. They were too small to throw away, too sharp to forget. A girl kept one in her apron pocket, a perfect spine from a tiny anchovy. She said it reminded her of her brother, who once promised he'd bring her back a necklace made from fish bones. He never did. But the one she kept was enough. Small, pale, fragile, but hers. Fish were food for the poor, but also for the persistent. They fed the laborers who couldn't stop, the travelers who couldn't rest. The children who needed to put something in their mouths before sleep would agree to visit. They were eaten in alleys, at doorways, on steps. No plates, no ceremony. Just a piece of cloth in the lap and fingers greasy with oil and memory. Rome smelled like them. Not always, but often enough that the scent became part of the background, like dust or heat or shouting. You could smell it on a man's breath and know he hadn't eaten in 2 days, and also that he finally had. A woman fried the tiny fish on a flat stone behind her stall. She didn't sell much, just what she could carry. But the smoke rising from her pan always attracted a crowd, not because the food was beautiful, but because it was possible. You could afford a handful of fish, and in that handful was everything: salt, fat, time. She sometimes gave the smallest ones to children who stared too long. Not because she was generous, but because she remembered being one of them. Even soldiers craved them, not for luxury, but for reliability. The taste didn't change. The strength it gave didn't lie. You could tuck one into your cloak and chew it before battle. It wouldn't make you brave, but it would make you present. In the grain districts, workers lined up for salted fish packed in clay jars. They were doled out with ladles, not in portions, but in smears. A streak of fish across flatbread, enough to color it, enough to remind you. Some dipped their fish into honey, believing it kept sickness away. Some buried the bones in soil after, eating as if to return them to the earth they never came from. Some just threw them aside, without meaning, only to step on them later and remember. Even the bones told stories, curved like question marks, snapped like twigs, sometimes so delicate they disappeared between your teeth. Other times so stubborn they stuck in your throat and stayed until morning. A man once said, "If you've never choked on a fishbone, you've never been truly hungry." He laughed after, but not loudly. A child asleep in his mother's arms clutched a fishtail like a doll. It was dry, bare, almost brittle, but he held it like comfort, because sometimes comfort is the thing that smells like survival, and survival often smells like salt, oil, and tiny bones. Meat had a smell that made the stomach lean forward. It was rich, unmistakable, part smoke, part promise, the kind of scent that caught in your throat and whispered things to your bones. You deserve this. You could be full. Just once. But in Rome, if you smelled meat, it usually meant it wasn't for you. It was for the merchants with fat purses, for the priests with blood on their hands and blessings on their tongues, for the households where meat was carved in thick slices, then wiped from the blade before being seen. For the rest, for the ones who built the roads, cleaned the floors, stitched the sandals, folded the tunics, fetched the water. Meat was more often the idea of food than the fact of it. You might taste it in broth, might chew it in paste, might dream of it while gnawing on barley cakes, but you wouldn't own it. Not often. Not really. And when you did, it wasn't what you thought. A vendor near the Subura once sold patties that looked like lamb, browned on the outside, warm in the center, wrapped in fig leaves. But bite into them, and the illusion broke. Crushed beans, bread crumbs, animal blood. A whisper of spice. No meat, not just memory. But that was enough to fool the tongue, if not the heart. A boy stood outside a butcher's stall once for so long, the owner threw him a scrap, not a cut, just a bone, stripped bare, sun-dried, flecked with marrow. The boy took it without a word. He sucked it slowly, as if it were candy. Later, he wrapped it in cloth and tucked it under his blanket. A treasure of was. In poor homes, meat was a festival, not a meal. The kind of thing tied to death, birth, or debt, slaughtered in celebration or desperation, always with more mouths than meat to go around. A mother might cut a single slice of pork into 5, then stew it with lentils, onions, and thyme. By the end, the meat was more suggestion than substance, but the smell filled the house, and that was half the battle. Some fried scraps from the markets, tendon, gristle, skin, crisped until chewable. They dipped them in vinegar, or rolled them in crushed herbs, or just salted them and hoped for the best. And then there were offcuts, tongue, liver, stomach, feet. Parts the rich never saw, parts that required work, boiling, peeling, seasoning. But they fed, they warmed, they lingered. A girl once made stew from a goat's foot, just one. She cracked it open herself, scraped the insides, boiled it for hours with lentils and roots. She didn't eat much of it, just the broth. She gave the rest to her brother. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Gratitude lived in the silence after a meal. In taverns, the cheapest dish was often the loudest. Tripe cooked in garum and onions. It smelled like regret, tasted like effort, but it filled the mouth, filled the gap, filled the space between waking and sleep. And in the streets, you might hear a sizzle from a small pan behind a curtain. Meat, maybe, or mushrooms, or bread soaked in broth and fried until it fooled the nose. Rome was clever like that. It knew how to mask hunger, how to dress up poverty, how to make a crust of bread smell like a feast, and make a stew taste like more than it was. Even the bones were useful. Boiled until brittle. Used again and again to flavor water, soften beans, lend their whisper to meals with no voice. A man once found a scrap of lamb in the market gutter. He picked it up, cleaned it on his sleeve, and ate it on the spot. A few looked away. Most didn't. They understood. Hunger doesn't leave room for shame. And still, sometimes, meat did find its way in. A neighbor dropped off a piece after a celebration. A relative gifted a pouch of dried sausage. A merchant, in a rare act of kindness, slipped a cooked chicken foot to a child sweeping the steps. These moments were rare, but they mattered. They reminded people that the world could be cruel, yes, but also unpredictable. And sometimes unpredictability brought meat. A woman once said, "We eat like emperors on the days no one expects it." She laughed after. A short sound, wrapped in warmth. And that night, she fried a sliver of fat with herbs and mixed it into mashed barley. Her children licked the bowl clean, because meat, even imagined, was powerful. It brought people together, around pots, around tables, around scraps, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. A promise, a softness, a rare, slow moment where the body could relax, just a little. And for one bite, maybe two, life didn't feel so hard. Before the crowd arrived, before the prayers began, before the incense curled and the drums beat, someone laid a fig on a stone. Just one. Soft, overripe, wrinkled like an old man's palm. It wasn't for the living. Not exactly. It was an offering. In Rome, food wasn't only for the hungry. It was for the gods, too. For statues and spirits and ideas dressed in marble. And every day, across the empire, bread and oil and fruit and meat were lifted high, carried in procession, placed on altars with bowed heads and careful fingers. But gods don't chew. And when the rituals ended, and the smoke faded, and the priests turned away, what remained? The crusts, the peels, the bones, the ashes didn't vanish. It was taken. By hands quieter than prayers. Not stolen, just retrieved. The temples had rules, of course. Offerings belonged to the divine. But the divine rarely came down to claim them. So the caretakers did. Or the beggars nearby. Or the workers who swept the stones at dawn and watched the figs spoil in the sun. What the gods left behind. A city took. And in those remnants, there was nourishment. Not always whole. Not always clean, but edible. Sometimes warm. A woman once wrapped her scarf around a heel of bread left near a statue of Ceres. She didn't eat it right away. She carried it home, broke it into soup, said nothing. Her children never asked where the bread came from. They just ate. Near the altar of Jupiter. A boy scraped dried honey from a platter. He used a twig, then his fingers, then his tongue. The guard looked away. Whether out of mercy or boredom, no one knew. The temples received abundance, piles of grain, clusters of grapes, roasted doves, wheels of cheese. Because when people feared the future, they fed the unseen. But the unseen didn't clean up. And so, at twilight, when the shadows stretched long and the marble cooled, the leftovers remained, sacred, stale, and salvaged. It was strange eating. Something meant for a god, stranger still. It often tasted better, not because of quality, but because of hope. That hope clings to sacred things, even after they're cold, even after they've been dropped, even when they've already been blessed, abandoned, and bitten once. A man once found half a pear beside a shrine. He looked around, whispered an apology, and took a bite. It was soft, sweet. He smiled like he hadn't tasted fruit in weeks. He probably hadn't. Others were bolder. They lingered behind ceremonies, eyes low, steps slow, pretending not to wait, but waiting. Always waiting. Some believed eating a god's food brought favor. Others believed it brought curses. Most believed neither. They were just hungry. Priests. Knew, of course. They saw the missing apples, the bread that thinned, the honey that vanished spoonful by spoonful. But they rarely said anything. The gods, if angered, did not strike. And the city, if ignored, starved. Once, during a festival, the offering tables overflowed. Cheese curdled in the sun. Wine warmed in brass bowls. Bread stiffened into stone. And after sunset, a family walked by, mother, father, 2 sons, and paused. They said no words. They reached for nothing. But when the youngest boy knelt and brushed a crumb into his hand, no one stopped him. He shared it, quietly. And Rome, in all its watching, said nothing, because it had seen this before, because it would see it again. Even the animals knew. Cats curled near temple steps, waiting for the chicken bones. Dogs hovered near the drains, where broth might trickle. Birds picked fruit pulp from cracks in the altar. Everyone believed in something. The hungry believed in ritual, too, in showing up, in pretending not to look too closely, in thanking the gods silently when food touched the tongue. A woman once called the leftovers divine crumbs. She wasn't being poetic. She meant it. She believed they held warmth others had forgotten. And maybe they did. Because when food is wrapped in prayer, when it's placed with intention, when it's touched by fear and faith, it holds something extra. Not nutrition, but meaning. And that's sometimes enough. Even if the bread is dry, even if the grapes are withered, even if the stew has cooled and thickened into something between food and memory, it still matters. Because someone once offered it with hope, and someone else received it with grace, and in that quiet exchange, across the space between altar and mouth, Rome breathed. Bathhouses of Rome were not silent places. They echoed, not with laughter, always, but with sound. The slap of sandals on wet stone, the hiss of steam, the low murmur of voices rising and falling like waves in a shallow basin. Water splashed, fire crackled, and somewhere nearby, beans boiled, not inside the baths, of course, but just outside, near the entrance, or tucked against the wall where warm air drifted and hungry bellies lingered. Because heat made, people craved not extravagance, not indulgence, but comfort. And nothing comforted quite like beans, boiled, salted, scented with garlic, if fortune smiled, served in a bowl if he had coin, a folded cloth if you did not. They were soft, cheap, and slow, like the city after. Sundown dock vendors knew the rhythm. They didn't shout. They stirred. A pot black with use. A ladle carved from wood older than memory. They waited until someone, still damp, still red from the heat of the caldorium, stepped close. And then they scooped a bowl, a hand, a smile. Maybe, it was not a meal, but a moment. A man might sit on the edge of a stone bench, beans steaming in his hands, and say nothing. Just breathe, just chew, just let the day fall off his shoulders, one bite at a time, because the bath washed the skin, but the beans warmed the soul. A woman once fed her daughter beans with her fingers, not because she had no spoon, but because it felt kinder. The girl giggled between bites. Her hair was still wet, her cheeks still flushed, her eyes heavy with sleep that hadn't yet arrived. That's what the bathhouse did, Dot. It softened everything. And the beans, well, they were the final softness. Some vendors mixed in barley or greens. Others offered olives on the side, small, wrinkled, briny. A rare treat. Occasionally, someone crumbled bread into the bowl to soak up the last of the broth. Nothing wasted. Not a drop. A soldier once said. The best part of returning to Rome wasn't the bath. It was the beans after. The taste of home, he called it. Though his home had been far from Rome, the beans had become his memory. Earthy, plain, reliable. Steam rose from the pots like incense. People gathered near, not in lines, but in clusters, leaning on pillars, sitting on steps, drying their feet. In the last of the evening's warmth, while chewing slowly, rhythmically, as if the food itself was breathing. Even those who didn't eat watched. They let the scent wash over them. Let the presence of food comfort them. Hunger doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just listens. Sometimes it just waits. One night, a boy brought his own pot. Cracked, dented, barely held together. He held it out with both hands. The vendor raised an eyebrow, then filled it, not generously, not cruelly, just enough. The boy ran off grinning, clutching it like treasure. He ate under the arches, with his back to the wall and his eyes to the stars. Between bites, he hummed. Beans made you do that, not because they were exquisite, but because they were safe. In a world that asked so much, safety was a flavor you learned to crave. The bathhouse staff often ate last, after the crowds had left, after the floors had been scrubbed, after the fires had been stoked for the morning heat. They sat together, bowls in hand, sharing silence more than food. One stirred vinegar into his, another sprinkled herbs. A third just ate as it came, plain, soft, warm. The beans spoke quietly to each of them. Thank you. You're done. Rest now. In the corners, a dog waited with ears perked. He'd learned which hands dropped pieces, which faces smiled, which laps might hold a scrap. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just watched. And when someone finally set down an empty bowl, still fragrant, he patted over and licked it clean. The night grew colder. The steam thinned, but the beans, or what was left of them, still simmered, still whispered. A girl collecting bowls wiped her nose on her sleeve and whispered, "Tomorrow, again." She didn't mean the work. She meant the beans, because they were always there. Like the baths. Like the warmth. Rome. It looked like wine. Red, swirling, darker in the center of the cup, lighter near the rim. It moved like wine, caught the lamplight. Like wine, clung to the mouth of clay jugs, like something richer than it was. But it wasn't. Not really. Not the wine you imagine. Aged, indulgent, poured in silver bowls by servants with soft hands. No, this was something else. It was watered, stretched, boiled with herbs. It was mixed with honey to cover the sourness, or vinegar to mimic the tang, sometimes with dried figs, sometimes with seawater, sometimes with nothing at all. But hope. It was wine for the rest of us. For those who worked in the sun until their shoulders cracked. For the ones who swept the streets and lit the lamps, and boiled the beans and mended the cloth. For those who needed something warm to end the day, but couldn't afford beauty, and so they drank wine that wasn't wine. A boy poured it from a cracked jug behind a tavern. The jug glugged, slow and stubborn. The cup it filled was chipped and stained. The boy didn't taste it first. He just handed it over to a man whose hands trembled, whose back bent like old wood. The man didn't thank him. He sipped slowly, let it sit on his tongue, then swallowed and sighed. That was all it took. One sip to take the edge off the ache, to soften the corners of the day, not to forget. No, that was too much to ask, but to blur. Just a little dot in. Alleys behind bakeries, men sat on overturned baskets and passed a cup between them. Each sip left a trace on the rim, the mark of dust, the trace of oil, the faint memory of garlic on the breath dot. No one minded. The wine burned, just a little, but then warmed, then dulled, then settled. A woman once said, "It's not good wine, but it's a good end." Then she laughed, not loudly, just enough to let her shoulders drop. She carried her cup home like it held fire. Some added rosemary, or thyme, or lemon peel if they were lucky. Others simply drank it as it came, warm from the pot, sour from the barrel, a live dot. And then there were the pitchers in public taverns, refilled with water when no one was looking, stretched for hours, shared by strangers. Nothing honest in it, but nothing cruel either. A man paid with a song. Just one verse, half remembered, sung with a cracked voice and kind eyes. The barkeep filled his cup without asking dot, because sometimes payment isn't coin. Sometimes it's presence. A young couple shared a cup between them, passing it back and forth like a secret. Their hands touched each time, not by accident. The wine made them braver, or quieter, or both. Children weren't given wine, but sometimes, when no one watched, they licked the rim of a cup and giggled. It tasted like spice, like stories, like something meant for later dot in the corners of Rome. Old men poured wine into bowls of stew. Let it boil. Let it thicken. Let it pretend to be meat dot in quiet homes. Widows poured wine into cups and whispered to husbands long gone dot in jails. Prisoners drank it from cracked pots and stared at the walls until they blurred dot. It was a drink. Yes, but it was also a ritual. End of the day, wrapped in bitterness and warmth. A mirror of the life that made it necessary. You didn't drink it for flavor. You drank it for peace. For a moment when your mouth was full of something other than complaint dot for a pause. A merchant once poured the last of his jug into his hand when the cup broke. He drank it from his palm, then licked his wrist, then smiled. Soldier once poured wine onto the ground before drinking, an offering to no one, or maybe everyone. Even the poorest knew the gesture dot raise. Sip, breathe. The wine wasn't sweet, but it was shared dot and sharing. In Rome was the difference between surviving and living dot at night. When the fires dimmed and the voices softened, you could hear it. The tap of cup on stone, the sigh after the swallow, the silence that followed. Wine. That wasn't wine dot, but still something. Still enough dot still Rome. There were streets in Rome that never quite slept dot not loud, not bright, just breathing, pulsing, alive in a way that whispered rather than shouted dot. And in those streets, tucked between shadows and stone, there was always a stall dot, always someone cooking something, always something warm or fried or forbiddens. Hunger wasn't the only thing being fed. There were foods not sold in the morning, not respectable, not polite. Fried pastries laced with herbs that made the tongue tingle. Skewers grilled over smoke that smelled too sweet to be meat. Cups of syrupy wine, thick with spice that made your ears ring and your memory melt. These weren't snacks. They were temptations. A stall for every craving. A flavor for every secret. A dish for every sin. A woman in a green shawl sold pastries filled with mashed dates and pepper. She didn't call out to customers. She didn't need to. The smell did the inviting. The price wasn't listed. It changed based on your eyes, how tired they looked, how much guilt you carried, or didn't. One man bit into a pastry and closed his eyes. His jaw moved slowly, like he didn't want the moment to end. He paid double. He didn't say why. Some stalls were tucked behind curtains, lit only by candlelight. You didn't speak when you entered. You pointed. You paid. You left Dot, and as you walked away, the grease on your fingers or the syrup on your lip told its own story. There was a vendor who sold roasted figs soaked in wine and honey, skewered together like a necklace. He said they cured nightmares. No one believed him. Everyone bought them anyway, even the priests, especially the priests, because sin has flavors too sweet, sharp, sticky. You could eat something in these streets and never tell a soul. You could taste something that made your knees weak and your heart beat louder and never speak of it again. Not because it was illegal, but because it was yours. Rome allowed for that. It had corners where judgment didn't follow, where food was a secret. Between the cellar and your silence. A girl once stole a pastry from one such stall. The vendor caught her, but instead of yelling, she handed the girl another. "Next time," she said, "pay with something better than fear." The girl nodded. She returned the next night with a song. Sang it softly. Paid in verse. A boy sold warm milk mixed with crushed almonds and something that smelled like flowers. He claimed it made you dream better, made your sleep deeper. Some nights, his line stretched around the corner. Even if it did nothing, the belief was enough. There was always something a little otherworldly about these stalls, as if they existed just outside of the city's laws, as if the rules didn't apply as long as the food was hot and the money quiet. A man once confessed, not to a priest, but to a fig vendor, that he hadn't tasted sugar in 3 years. The vendor handed him a fig and said, "Then don't talk. Chew." He did. No one ever really knew who owned these stalls. They came and went, set up at dusk, vanished by dawn. Some never returned. Some were there every night for years, but all of them fed Rome's other. Appetite. Not for calories. But for release. Something to lick from your fingers. While no one watched. Something warm enough to hold the cold at bay. Something sweet enough to make you feel, just for a moment, like maybe the world was soft again. Woman bought a honey cake every Wednesday. Never missed a night. Never said a word. Just handed over the coin, took the cake, and disappeared into the dark. One night, the vendor asked, "Why always Wednesday?" She paused, looked down. It was the night he left. The vendor said nothing. She paid double. Rome was a city of hunger, but not all hunger was for food. Some was for comfort, some was for silence, some was for the feeling of something forbidden on the tongue. And the stalls gave it, without permission, without apology. Without names. Just food. Hot, fragrant, unforgettable. A stall for every sin, a bite for every ache. And in the corners of the night, where moonlight met steam, that was more than enough. They marched on worn roads, stone beneath them, dust behind them, miles ahead, and no kitchens in sight. Roman soldiers were not soft men, but they still hungered like anyone else. And what they carried, tucked in satchels, tied in cloth, sealed in jars, wasn't feast. Food. It was junk food, of the most practical kind, crude, dense, long-lasting, meant to be chewed with teeth hardened by war and time. Salted meat, dried bread, hard cheese, and a handful of small, uncelebrated things that kept a soldier moving when home felt far and tomorrow looked uncertain. A strip of smoked pork, brittle as bark. A piece of barley biscuit that needed to be soaked in water or wine before it could be swallowed. A fig, sun-dried and wrinkled like a priest's thumb, tucked away like a secret reward for surviving another day. They didn't eat seated. They ate standing, walking, waiting. One hand on the hilt, the other breaking crust. Was no time for flavor. But still, some found ways to care. A soldier once carved a little notch into his cheese before every bite. He said it made the piece last longer. Another always saved the last bite of anything for nightfall. Not because he wanted to, but because he feared waking up to nothing. Meals were moments. Not planned, not prepared. Just taken whenever. The wind slowed or the orders paused. They drank from shared flasks, wine mixed with water, warmed by the sun. Sometimes bitter, sometimes comforting. And then came the more inventive ones. The soldier who mixed crushed nuts with dried grapes, mashed them into a ball, and wrapped them in cloth like a sacred object. The one who always carried a little bag of cumin seeds to sprinkle over whatever he found. The one who saved the rind of a lemon for weeks, just to suck on when his tongue felt dead from dust. They joked about it, sometimes. Called it soldier's stew. A handful of regret oiled with memory. But when the cooking pots came out, if they came out, the smell would rise, and all talk would stop. Some stews were made from hardtack soaked until soft, boiled with scraps of onion or roots pulled from the ground. No meat, not usually, just what could be found or remembered. One night, a soldier shared a piece of sweetened barley cake his sister had made before he left. It was old, crumbling, but still sweet. He broke it into 5 pieces, gave 4 away. A silence followed that no victory had ever earned, because sweetness on the road was almost sacred. Others kept pickled garlic or sour apples, things that lasted, things that punched the mouth awake. You didn't savor them, you survived them. A legionary once said the taste of victory wasn't glory, it was a cold bean pie that didn't spoil. The rations were heavy, often carried by slaves or mules, or else packed tight against the body. They grew warm, damp, sour, and yet eaten without complaint, because in a camp of 6,000 men, the one thing no one could afford was weakness. So they chewed. Quietly, deliberately. And when the chewing ended, the walking began again. Sometimes they traded. A date for a better cup. A twist of fried dough for a story from home. A slice of meat for a memory too big to carry alone. They told stories over food, even bad food. Especially bad food, because bad food deserved company, and laughter could season anything. They roasted what they could catch, small birds, rats, sometimes worse. But they shared, always, a small circle, a borrowed knife, a piece passed from hand to hand as if it were gold. In that moment, it was not for the flavor. But for the fellowship, for the feeling of being full, even if only for a moment, for the reminder that, despite everything, they were still men, still human, still hungry. And Rome, grand and distant, could keep its feasts. On the march, they had something else. Not abundance. But enough. Enough to move forward, enough to swallow, enough to make it to tomorrow. And in that, there was honor. In Rome, hands had rules. The right hand blessed, greeted, pointed, and praised. The right hand made decisions, held coins, wrote letters. The right hand was seen, but the left was for what the world didn't talk about, for wiping, for washing, for carrying what couldn't be displayed. And so, quite often, the left hand held the bread, not out of shame, out of necessity. Because in a city where pride stood taller than stone, hunger had to make do with the hand that did not draw attention. People walked through alleyways with loaves pressed under left arms, fingers curled around crusts, knuckles, stained with flour and sweat. It wasn't elegance, it was function. The left hand was steady. It could hold a piece while the right hand paid a vendor. It could tuck food close while weaving through a crowd. It could lift the heel of bread to the mouth when the right was too tired to move. And still, no one talked about it. No one praised it, but the left hand fed Rome. A boy carried home a round of barley bread, warm from the communal oven. He held it to his chest with his left hand, as if shielding it from the world. His right was free, to wave, to open doors, to gesture politely to neighbors who might question what a child was doing carrying a loaf alone. But he knew better. He was protecting it. A woman walking to the baths kept her lunch wrapped in cloth. A slice of cheese, a handful of olives, and a piece of bread tucked neatly in her left palm. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Her fingers knew its shape. Its weight. It would be eaten with wet hair and tired legs, sitting on a sun-warmed step, but not now. Now the left hand held it, like a promise. Vendors handed loaves from right to left, one side offering, the other receiving. And still, always, the bread found its way to the left, even among friends. A man tore a chunk from his lunch and passed it across the table, not with flair, not with show, just a quiet motion of the left hand, as if saying, "Here, you don't have to ask." Some said it was luck or superstition, that eating with your left hand meant humility, that blessings passed more freely when the right hand stayed clean. But in truth, it was just survival. You used what you had, and when your life was work and walking and waiting, you kept one hand for the world and one for the hunger. A child crouched beside a fountain, soaking a stale crust in the stream. His left hand gripped the bread tightly, refusing to let it crumble. His right hand steadied him on the ledge. He watched the water rise through the cracks and soften the edges. Then he bit in, eyes closed. Chewed slowly. The left hand didn't. Trembled. It never did. It had held too much. Not just food, but burden. Pails of water. Baskets of washing. Ropes, tools, sleeping children. And yet, it never complained, because the left hand knew its place. In the kitchen. It stirred when the right hand reached. At the table. It tore when the right hand pointed. In the street. It carried when the right hand waved. And in the quiet, the left hand fed the soul. A priest once said that bread was sacred, that every bite echoed with the labor of hands long dead, that even the way we held it mattered. He didn't mention which hand, but everyone knew. Bread eaten with the right hand was for guests. Bread eaten with the left was for you. At midnight, when the house was still, a girl crept to the hearth where a half-loaf waited. She didn't light a candle. She didn't want the light. Her left hand found the crust, pulled it gently, tucked it close. She didn't eat right away. She just held it, because some nights, bread isn't about eating. About knowing it's there. The city didn't see these things. It saw statues. It saw speeches. It saw victories carved into stone. But it didn't see the left hand, the hand that held the bread while the world turned its face away, the hand that stayed close to the belly, the hand that didn't ask for praise, but never dropped. The loaf. In that quiet loyalty, there was grace, there was dignity, there was Rome. Not all food was fresh. In fact, most WAs and single quotes tea. By the time it reached the streets, the stalls, the pots, or the hands that hadn't held a coin in days, it had already changed, softened, hardened, soured, dried, cracked. Spoiled, maybe. But safe enough. Rome was not wasteful. It couldn't afford to be. In a city so large, so layered, so crowded with mouths in motion. The line between edible and inedible blurred like breath on glass. A cheese might smell sharp, but if it didn't crawl, it could be scraped. A loaf might be rock hard, but soaked in wine, it became dinner. A fish might shine with age, but fried fast and salted well, it fooled the tongue just long enough. People didn't throw food away. They fixed it, boiled it, pickled it, smothered it in oil or herbs, dried it until the decay became flavor. Cut Away the bad and kept the rest, because even spoiled food had value, not just as fuel, but as proof. Proof that you are still trying, still clever, still here. A man near the tanner's district once bought a jar of olives with white bloom on the skin. The vendor shrugged. "A little son," he said. The man didn't argue. He rinsed them in vinegar and garlic and served them to friends as if they'd come fresh from the press. They all smiled. No one asked. A woman found a peach bruised on one side. She cut it open slowly, circled the dark flesh with a knife, and placed the clean piece on a crust of bread. She gave the bruised side to the birds. Not out of waste, but respect. Even rot had layers, and those who lived closest to hunger knew how to peel them. There were stalls that sold yesterday's meat, sliced thin, soaked in vinegar, fried twice. There were jars of pickled cabbage that had sat in the sun too long, now sharper, stranger, but oddly satisfying. There were porridges so sour they made the lips pucker, but filled the belly like forgiveness. Rome fed itself on food it had already tried to leave. A boy once bit into a date so dark with age, crumbled in his mouth. He didn't spit. He chewed with care, like he was tasting memory. When he swallowed, he licked his fingers, quietly. Content, spoilage, after all, wasn't an ending. It was a phase, a change. A test of will. Vendors had sayings for it. Old fish, hot oil, bad bread, better stew. Mold feeds the brave. And they weren't wrong. You learn to eat with your nose, with your eyes, with your hope. Because survival required more than caution. It required compromise. A cracked egg, boiled twice, sour milk, stirred into grain, overripe figs, mashed with vinegar and sold as sauce. Nothing wasted, not even what no longer wanted to be food. In the back, rooms of taverns. Cooks scraped the black from cheese, trimmed the green from sausage, rinsed the rice until the water ran clear, or until no one asked questions. It wasn't deception. It was mercy. Some flavors only came after the rot had spoken. Some meals only tasted whole after they had nearly broken. A girl mixed spoiled beans with honey and lemon, called it sweet mash. Her mother laughed, then asked for seconds. A baker turned stale loaves into pudding, soaked in wine and cloves, sold them for less. They became a favorite. Spoilage taught you to be resourceful. To see more and less. To find comfort in corners. To forgive food its failures. The way we hope to be forgiven for ours. A man once opened a jar of pickled onions with a hiss that smelled like something better left closed. He blinked, stirred, tasted, then added cumin and called it desire. It wasn't, but it was edible. And sometimes edible was divine, because in Rome, food wasn't about pleasure. Not always. It was about persistence. The ability to take what was nearly gone and make it stay. To take the smell that made others wrinkle their nose and turn it into a meal that made them ask for more. Woman saved the cores of apples too soft to slice, boiled them, strained them, mixed them with barley. Her children called it jam. She let them, because what mattered wasn't the truth of the food. It was what it gave back. Warmth, volume. A reason to gather. In homes that echoed with emptiness. Spoiled food brought sound. The bubbling of pots, the tapping of knives, the clinking of spoons. It brought people together. With delight, but with dignity. Spoiled? Maybe, but safe, because it filled the bowl, because it filled the pause between despair and another day, because it said, in its strange and sour way, I'm still here. It didn't ask for much, not marble toys or golden coins, just a fig, a scrap, a spoonful of something sweet. In the back alleys of ancient Rome, where laundry flapped between crumbling walls and the air smelled like wet dust and oil, small feet moved quickly. And small mouths waited, always hungry, for something anything to chew. Children didn't have coins. They had eyes. Big ones. Wide ones. The kind that stared long and soft at the right vendor until a crust or a corner or a pit of something warm was passed down like a gift. And most days, that was enough. The world of Roman children was not one of feasts. It was a world of leftovers. But to them, it was magic. The burnt edges of a honey cake scraped from the pan. A cooled chickpea from someone else's cone. A spoon dipped into a stranger's broth when the bowl was nearly dry. They knew where to. Wait. Near the cheese stalls when the wheels were being sliced. Near the bread ovens when the ashes cooled. Near the carts that rattled with roasted nuts, where one or two always slipped through the cracks. Children's cravings were simple, sweet, warm, chewy, if possible. And if not, crunchy was just fine. Boy once followed a man carrying a slab of fried dough longer than his own arm. The man didn't notice, but he dropped a small piece at the turn of the alley. The boy picked it up, blew on it, and sat down as though he'd been served a banquet. Another girl crouched near a fig vendor, pretending to nap. When the wind blew too hard and a basket tipped, she was suddenly awake, and so were her hands. A dried fig, flattened by footsteps, was still a fig. Even in Rome, where children weren't considered citizens, their appetites declared them present. Not loud, but constant. And someone always noticed. A mother broke her bread in 3 pieces. One for the baby, one for the older one, one for herself, but only if the others weren't watching. A grandmother saved the oilskins from olives, the brine-soaked bits too salty for grown tongues, and gave them to the toddlers who chewed. With delight, faces wrinkled and smiling. Vendors, even the cruel ones, had a soft spot. They flicked crumbs from their tables, not by accident. They left sauce to drip just low enough for a quick swipe. They shooed children with their voices, not their hands. There was unspoken permission in the streets of Rome. So long as you were fast, so long as you were small, so long as you didn't take too much. Some children learned the smell of candy root before they could read. Licorice, they called it, dark, earthy, and sweet at the end. Sometimes a stick could be traded for a song, or a smile, or a chore done without asking. Children helped carry firewood, helped count eggs, helped run errands. For food they'd never taste, but sometimes someone thanked them with a roasted almond, a spoonful of lentils, a plum that had grown too soft for sale. The taste of something new was a memory. They carried longer than a lesson. Ask a Roman child what day it was, and they'd shrug. Ask them what they ate last time it rained, and they'd remember. Boiled millet, earned crusts, a stolen apricot, a date pit chewed so long it turned to paste. That was their calendar. That was their record. A boy once found a lump of candied pine nut dropped from a rich man's sleeve. He didn't eat it, not at first. He held it like treasure, showed it to his sister, showed it to the cat. Then finally, at sunset, he placed it on his tongue and closed his eyes. To him, that sweetness lasted hours. And maybe it did. Because for the hungry, taste is time. And craving is hope. Some children sucked on bread soaked in wine. Some chewed stalks of fennel like candy. Some crushed acorns and whispered that they were pastries. Imagination helped the hunger go down. A bowl of porridge could become a feast if eaten slowly, with a friend. 2 boys once shared a single olive, each biting 1/2. They argued about who got the better side, then laughed until they forgot the olive entirely. That was a kind of feast, too. The laughter was thick and golden like honey, echoing between broken walls, sticky with sunlight. And it fed them. In Rome, children didn't ask why food was scarce. They didn't know the Senate. They didn't know the grain boats. They knew the corners. The sounds of a pan being scraped. The smell of vinegar rising. The clink of coins they didn't have. And the silence that came when someone gave them something anyway. At night, mothers rubbed oil on small bellies. Not full, but quiet. Fathers pretended the stew was meatier than it was. Stories were told of emperors who ate clouds, of gods who drank stars, of animals who never went hungry. And maybe the children believed them. Or maybe they just liked the sound of a story with food in it. Some fell asleep with crumbs still on their lips. Some dreamed of boiled apples, roasted barley, and cakes made only of air and sweetness. And in those dreams, they always had enough. They always had more. And they always shared. Because, even in fantasy, Roman children knew a treat was best when someone else was smiling beside you. They remembered the smells more than the meals. The scent of burnt oil at dawn. The ghost of ash that clung to cloth and crust. And hunger, not as an ache, but as a rhythm. A familiar presence, as common as dust, as quiet as breath. In the alleys of ancient Rome, where stones stayed warm into the night and smoke drifted low along the rooftops, food was less a promise and more a suggestion. It lived in dreams, in air, in the twitch of the nose when a cart rattled by with anything that sizzled. By the time someone noticed it, the food was already gone. All that remained was the echo of garlic, the shimmer of oil scraped from a pan, the wet crackle of a fire dying beneath a pot too small for the number of mouths that waited. They didn't speak about being hungry. It was understood, like weather. You noticed it in the way people watched others eat. In the quiet way, fingers lingered over crumbs. In the slowness of chewing, as if drawing the moment out would make it last longer. Sometimes they ate ash. Not as punishment, not for ceremony, but because when bread was baked too fast or too low, it came out black. And black bread was still bread. They dipped it in water. They rubbed it with garlic. They told children it was extra smoky, and that was meant to be special. The children nodded and chewed. Because taste didn't matter as much as warmth. A spoonful of bean mash, gone cold. A handful of old barley. Olives so salty it made eyes squint. No one complained. That would waste energy. Instead, they joked. This one will make your hair grow, a woman would say as she handed her son a lump of something nearly gray. And this one will make you run faster, a man would say, passing a square of flour paste with no flavor at all, and the boy would laugh. And eat. In the street stalls, vendors scraped their pots more than they stirred them. Old grease from fried cheese was reused 3, 4, 5 times, each layer adding a new shade of flavor, or maybe just shadow. And still, it was better than nothing. At night, hunger had its own sound. It wasn't just stomachs. It was wood being snapped for fire when there was no meal to cook. It was the clink of empty bowls being stacked, too clean for how little they'd held. It was silence after a question that had no answer, like, is there any more? But even in the hunger, there was memory. Memory of better days, of sweeter figs, of bread that was soft and still warm from the bakery. They talked about those days often and softly, as if speaking too loudly might scare them away. Ash fell from rooftops where chimney smoke curled. Oil hardened in pans, left out overnight. Hunger curled up beside families like a second child. Not loved, but not cast out either. They found small comforts. A single dried date split in half. A flat cake of barley and honey, hardened like stone, sucked like candy. Wine watered down to near nothing, sipped like a story. People learned to stretch time, not food. They let their meals cool before eating, as if patience could make it taste better. They chewed longer. They spoke slowly around the fire, making the moment feel bigger than the meal itself. And it worked. For a time, at least the dot ash was brushed from red like snow. Oil was wiped from fingers onto sleeves, already stiff with yesterday's grease. And hunger was not defeated, only delayed. But even that felt like victory, Dot, because each day they lived through it, each day they found just enough to go on, was a kind of feast. Not for the body, but for the will. The poorest shared salt and stories. They salted the beans too much, just to taste something. They laughed about how dry the bread was, how chewy the chestnuts, how thin the soup. They said the oil had personality. The ash had texture, Dot, and in those moments, hunger took a step back. They remembered market days, not for what they bought, but for what they saw. The pyramids of cabbages they couldn't afford. The gleam of honey cakes behind cloth-covered counters. The rare moment when a vendor, out of pity or distraction, let a child snatch a fig from the pile. That fig, eaten in secret, tasted like legend, Dot, and later, in sleep, that taste returned. Because hunger has dreams too, Dot, in dreams. The pots were full. The oil was golden and clean. The ash was gone. And yet, even in dreams, they did not overeat. They still chewed slowly, still looked over their shoulders, still saved the last bite for someone else, Dot, because when you live with hunger long enough, you learn to feed others first, if only in imagination. And when the sun rose again over the tiled rooftops and pigeons fluttered in the steam, they started all over, Dot, looking for warmth, for a scrap, for something to chew between chores, between prayers, between silences. Oil, ash, hunger. These were not curses. They were companions, not kind ones, but consistent. Can that, in a world full of change and decay and coin-toss fortune, was something. The Romans who lived like this, they weren't remembered in scrolls. No statues were carved of them, but their hunger built the city, their oil fed the fires. Their ashes were swept away, and yet still remain. In the scent of bread that lingers after the last bite. In the silence that follows a shared crust. In the stories told with empty hands and full hearts. And that brings us to the end of the day, when there's nothing left to eat but dreams and the hope that tomorrow something warm might return. The fires have long gone out. The pans are cold now, stacked in corners where rats whisper and dust settles like memory. But the taste remains. Not on the tongue, not in the teeth, but somewhere quieter. In the breath you take when you smell warm oil, in the pause between hunger and hope, in the silence before a meal you almost didn't have. This isn't about feasts. It never was. Not marble banquet halls. Not grapes peeled by servants. Not golden platters passed between silk-robed senators. No. This was the food of shadows. Of alleys. Of tired hands and borrowed coins in mornings too long for their own good. Bread stretched beyond reason. Cheese that smelled stronger than it tasted. Oil so reused it had stories of its own. And still, it was beautiful, because it meant you were still here, still chewing, still tasting, still alive. Somewhere in the belly of the city, a boy once bit into a crust so dry it crumbled into powder. He laughed, and then he licked the dust from his palm, because even crumbs were something. And in a world that gave so little, something was everything. His name was never recorded. No statue bears his likeness. No scroll wrote down the moment his stomach turned from empty to not quite full. But he lived, and he tasted. There's a story in every bite. We forget to remember. The cone of chickpeas eaten near a bathhouse, shared between friends with damp hair and tired feet. The honey cake a mother saved for her child, only to find it melted in the sun. The fishbone tucked in cloth, kept as a snack, but lost to time. These were not grand. They were not plated with care or served with ceremony, but they were enough. That is what lingers. In every age, food is memory. But in the quietest corners of history, It is survival. The cracked olive pit spat into the dust. The ash-streaked bread passed between laborers on a scaffolding. The wine so thin it barely counted, yet warmed the chest like a blessing. And those moments, they made up lives, they carried people forward, day by day, mouthful by mouthful. In a Roman alley, not far from where empires were debated and roads were paved, a woman once sold fried dough. It was simple, greasy, barely sweet, but the line in front of her stall never vanished, because hunger didn't wait, and comfort came hot and fast. People bought it with their last coin, or begged for it, or traded a song, or a smile, or a secret. She never kept track, because she too was hungry, not just for food, but for company, for ritual, for routine. In a world where nothing was promised, she gave them one thing that was warmth. Maybe that's what junk food really was. A promise. Not that you'd be full, not that it would last. But that, just for now, you'd feel okay. That something would crunch. That something would be soft. That someone, somewhere, thought of you when they made it, even if they didn't know your name. The historians don't talk about this. They talk about emperors, and edicts and battles and trade routes. But no one draws maps of hunger. No one charts the taste of boiled cabbage outside a bathhouse. No one records the way oil hisses when it touches a hot pan on a cold night. And yet, these things mattered. They mattered deeply. Because you can't build an empire on empty stomachs. You can't survive a winter without salt. You can't go to sleep with nothing, not every night. And so, they made something, even when it was barely enough. Now, centuries later, we don't have their recipes. We can't taste their chickpeas. We don't know how their bread truly smelled. We guess and imagine and reconstruct, but we can still feel it, the soft longing, the quiet hope, the simple joy of having one thing to eat when there could have been nothing. That's what stayed. A fig shared between sisters, a crust torn and dipped in sour wine, a curl of cheese handed down like a gift, not for indulgence, but for continuity, for love. Because sometimes love looks like half a loaf wrapped in cloth. Sometimes it sounds like a bubbling pot on a cold morning. Sometimes it smells like garlic and old oil and burned flour, and feels like a hug. In this world, we often chase new tastes, exotic, shiny, bold. But the Romans who lived and loved in the shadows of marble arches knew something else, that the simplest food is the most lasting, not because it fills us up, but because it connects us. To fire, to family, to each other. So tonight, as the world goes quiet and your room grows still, think of them, the hands that made the dough, the children that begged for honey, the elders who sat by the stalls just to smell the cooking. The elders who sat by the stalls just to smell the cooking. They were here. They mattered. And so did the food they ate. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival and comfort and the small sacred act of eating something warm when the world outside was cold. And that is the taste that time forgot. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real, too humble, too ordinary, too soft to last in stone. But it lasted here, in this story, in your mind, in the quiet space just before sleep. So close your eyes now, and let the scent of garum, the crackle of oil, the warmth of half a crust carry you gently into dreams. Because tonight, as always, even in dust and silence, someone, somewhere, is still chewing.